All right. So hopefully everything's going well for you. And if not, I'm sorry. I'm sure class will be better. Oh, I feel like somebody just came. Crud. You guys can't punk me right after I had surgery. I feel like somebody just came in who's not supposed to be here. Maybe I'm wrong. No, I don't think I'm wrong, but they cried. Why would somebody come into our class that isn't supposed to be here? You have any thoughts about that? Okay. Maybe I'm probably wrong. You're all supposed to be here. So we'll go ahead and get started. It's nobody with a weird name, so you're probably just, when are the questions due? When are the questions due? They're not due this week. They're due next week, next Friday. So yeah, next Friday. And I know I made the list for you to study for the quiz, and I haven't, well, you can't take the quiz till next Wednesday anyway, so I'm going to tell you the quiz isn't in there yet, but you don't care. You don't care about that. Let's talk about stuff you do care about, the 1920s. So today's chapter, tomorrow, or Thursdays as well, chapter about the Roaring 20s, and we'll probably finish it a little early on Thursday and then get started a little bit with the 1930s. Honestly, the Great Depression chapter is pretty full, so and we'll talk more about the weekly question next time. The weekly question, is describe the causes of the Great Depression. We'll talk about that a little today, but more next time. There's a little more cultural stuff, which is what your questions, your multiple choice questions are about. Be specific and detailed in your discussion of the causes of the Great Depression, and the book will be super helpful on that as well. What laws or absence of laws might have set the conditions for this event. What were the government responses to the Depression before 32? So what I'm asking in that question is, what did Herbert Hoover do? Sounds like I'm crying, but I promise you I'm not. It's just my voice. And were they effective? Although the Great Depression really was sad, but I'm not crying. Okay. Oh, ow. Okay. So in the 20s, did I actually share that with you? Right. Let me try again. Okay. Now I shared the screen with you. Okay. I've done this before, right? All right. So in the 20s, our culture is odd. Can I say that? Are you okay with that? Maybe that sounds judgmental. But there's a lot of conservative things about the culture. There's some racist things about the culture. There's some new music styles, that kind of stuff. So it's really kind of a mix of things. And it's kind of a party decade, but without alcohol officially, but unofficially, there's a lot of alcohol. So it's sort of like, I'm going to say it's sort of like high school. Should I say that? You guys probably don't drink though. When I was a kid, 100 years ago in high school, part of my high school years, the drinking age in Texas was 18, which is a huge mistake, by the way. So I think there may have been more drink. I don't know. We're not talking about drinking. Well, we will a little, but Sacco and Vanzetti, let me mention this case. The book talks about it. Sacco and Vanzetti were, one of them was a fish seller. I think he sold fish, and the other one, I can't remember what he did. But they get accused of robbing and killing a paymaster at a shoe factory. And apparently someone else did that, and then they went back to Italy. Not they, the guys who did it, and they left their car with Sacco and Vanzetti. They said, "Hey, we got to go back to Italy. Do you want our car?" And you know, who's turning down a free car, right? So they took the car. They get caught with the car and the murder weapon. Now, you know, they don't have CSI back then. They can't test the murder weapon, so they don't know for sure that it's the murder weapon. But you know, they know that it was looks like the car leaving the scene, and you know, the guy was shot. What they find out in the investigation is that it probably wasn't them, but they go ahead and accuse them. They pay some witnesses to testify against them. The police plant some evidence against them. They have a judge who's super racist, or at least a little racist, and says, you know, we need to go ahead and convict these darn Italian immigrants and get it over with. And they do, and they convict them and sentence them to death. A lot of the information that I just mentioned to you comes out during the trial, or after the trial, excuse me, during the appeals process. And the Supreme Court refuses to hear the appeal, and the United States government executes them. So, sorry. People all over the world will protest the execution. Some people in the United States as well. And if you're wondering, do we just dislike them because they're Italian immigrants? No, that's not the only reason. Because they were Italian immigrants who were anarchists as well. So a lot of anarchists during that time period, which I think is a little similar to what we're seeing a bit now politically, because I don't know, I've read some stuff about the protests that you're seeing in some major cities with kind of mixed in with Black Lives Matter, and some other folks are some unusually organized, regionally or locally organized groups of anarchists, which is kind of weird, but sorry, typically anarchists just tear stuff up and want to destroy organized government. So, and that differs regionally, you know, different countries, anarchists maybe want different things. But these two guys get executed, and it's really kind of a sign that we're not as interested in justice as we are maybe revenge against groups we're frustrated with. So the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, has a guy who's involved in their legal defense area named Felix Frankfurter. We'll talk about him later because he'll get on the Supreme Court, and he'll be involved in a fairly important case later on. But he writes a very long article in the Atlantic magazine explaining all the reasons that Sacco and Vanzetti should not be executed. And it's clearly not effective, but it does enhance Felix Frankfurter's reputation as being defender of civil liberties in some ways, but also gets people to think that he also, as an immigrant, maybe is not as loyal to the United States as he should be. All right, so stuff that matters in the 20s. Looking to see if I missed any questions. Doesn't look like it. The automobile. The automobile matters a lot in the 20s. Now, Ford is the major manufacturer in that era, but the book also mentions that General Motors becomes really big during that time period, in part because General Motors gives you more options of what type of car you could buy, what model, what color, that sort of thing. I have no idea if that is the case in the modern era. What I have noticed is in Austin, people like to buy Tesla. When I taught at Cedar Park High School and I was considering purchasing a car, I know my students told me that's what I should buy. So apparently Tesla is the thing. However, during this time period, Ford or General Motors. Almost every family started buying cars during this time period. I really should say car. Most families had one car. And cars will change our culture and our economy in some dramatic ways. So Ford has, really efficient plants, moving assembly line kind of things, and other industries and other car makers copy that. Ford also will have plants to help them supply things throughout the world. Excuse me. They mention in this chapter the Fordlandia plant in Brazil, which helps to manufacture tires. It's near the rainforest, so that's, wouldn't be something we'd approve of in the modern era. And the River Rouge plant, which I think is still there in Michigan. Excuse me. Sorry. So Ford reshapes how people work, the moving assembly line, um, working in a manufacturing plant. In some ways, safer working conditions, higher wages, those some positive things, and also a more affordable product. So Ford really kind of leads the way in more efficient manufacturing. And this, of course, is the era, and it'll last, a good 20, 30 years, where the United States becomes the major manufacturing country in the world. And that, of course, because car production is big and cars are more affordable, and people start to buy cars by making payments. You don't buy it all at once, which is, still happens today. It enhances lots of other industries, but also puts us in a little bit of debt. The other industries that are enhanced are railroads, road building, and we'll get better roads during this time period. Not great ones like we have now, mostly. Those start to be produced in the 1950s. But steel, glass, rubber, anything that has to do with manufacturing cars or things that cars use. Increases our mobility, so we go more places. Now, this is not road trip era because these cars aren't that great, but people do go camping more. They might go to restaurants that they can't walk to. They don't have drive-through restaurants or drive-ins or anything like that yet. That's more of a 50s thing. But you will also see an independent teen culture start to develop. And it's not that people are buying cars for their kids. They're not, because most families can afford one. And nobody in their right mind would give the teen the only car. However, they do let them use them on the weekend. So kids will have less supervision and they'll get out of control. So this is really the era where you start to see editorials and old people complaining about kids nowadays. Because honestly, before this era, kids nowadays were just little adults. So this is where a separate teen culture starts to develop, and there's supposed to be kind of this period, this adolescent period between being a kid and being a full-fledged adult with responsibilities. And that period probably was pretty short, depending on if your family had a little bit more money, but it was probably shorter then than it is now. My assumption, I don't have any data to back that up, but all right. Stock market was rising consistently in the 20s, and the thought was it would rise forever, which of course wasn't true, as we will find out. Not every industry is doing well, and even those industries that we just mentioned don't do well throughout the entire decade. Anything related to agriculture is going kind of poorly. So if you grow stuff for food or to make textiles, cotton industry is not going well. In part because we've already talked about the market going away. Plus, they're making artificial fabrics. Anything that's stretchy has something artificial in it, and they start to have stretchy stuff during that time period. I think nylon, maybe polyester. And those things are all made out of petroleum products. So that also means the oil industry is finding other ways to sell stuff. And farmers had done really well during World War I because they could sell their crops overseas, and that wasn't as true anymore. And in the 20s, you really start to see cooperation between the federal government and business. So the government would intentionally pass laws that helped big business, and they saw that as a partnership that made sense because it was in the best interest of the federal government for the economy to improve. So this is something, oh, so sorry, something probably beyond libertarianism where, you want the government to stay out of business. This is really the government helping big business. So like tax incentives or something like that in the modern era, perhaps. All right, so 20s is very pro-business. Federal government, major corporations should work in partnership, and then you'll hear presidents say things like, the business of America is business, and what's good for General Motors is good for America, or The man who builds a factory builds a temple, and the man who works there worships there. So you'll hear lots of interesting statements like that from your presidents, who are not, even pretending that the government's supposed to do anything other than help out big business. And we had this brief period during the progressive era where the thought was the government was supposed to help people who were in need and fix problems, but we got tired of that, to be honest. And if you look at our modern history, like 20th century and beyond, we kind of do that still, where we have these moments where we think the government should provide healthcare for everyone, or should end poverty or something like that. And then usually we go like, nope, that was too much. And then we kind of go back the other direction. There may be times where it seems like we're in the middle, but there aren't very many of those times, my impression. So the 20s more pro-business, and people aren't as worried about making sure that workers are safe, or that they're protected by the government. Now, I'm not telling you that we go back to dangerous working conditions. Those improvements stay around, because what we figure is that it's good for business for the plant not to blow up and for the workers not to get hurt. So even though workers' rights are declining and unions are losing power during this time period, and businesses are able to force workers to avoid, or to prevent, they are able to prevent workers from joining unions through the use of something called a yellow dog contract. And I really don't know, I'm sorry, I don't know why it's called a yellow dog contract. However, I do know what a yellow dog contract is. And it's where if you agree to work for a certain business, they can have as part of the job offer that you are not allowed to join a union. So it's sort of like the entire country was Texas during that time period. Although in Texas, you certainly are allowed to join a union. I shouldn't make it seem like that. And worker behavior codes are very common during this time period. I have heard, I taught high school for a long time. I know I've mentioned that before. And often I would have students say funny things to me like, I don't know why we have to have a dress code because you don't have to have one at work. Not true. And you have jobs, you have to have a dress code at work. But the dress code at work kind of thing sort of started in this era, and they had behavior codes as well. So I think work and school were very similar during that time period. Excuse me, sorry. So, do you ever say funny things like that to your teachers? Like, why do we have to have a dress code? You don't have to have one. This is where I'm checking to see if you're paying attention. Or why can't we wear a hat? You can wear hats now, though, I think. Didn't they just change your dress code?
I don't think so.
Oh. Well, does it matter? Are they checking?
They changed it before the school year started.
Yeah. I know there's actually some controversy about your dress code. There's some stuff coming up at the next school board meeting, too.
Tank tops, hats, and shorts and all that you can now wear to school.
Okay. Like you're going anyway. Oh, no, you're going to be going soon. Now, I know that people would argue, and my students would argue the same, that the dress code was sexist. And it did have more rules about girls than boys, for sure. It did. And some of my female students would say, why is it my fault that boys are distracted and can't pay attention to their work? I go, I'm not in charge of this. Just put some clothes on. That was, and the hat thing. I don't know about the hat thing. But it looks like you guys got some stuff changed, so that's good. All right, so political activism for students, good job. All right. Workers' rights, we talked about that. Oh, the ERA, we, like I'm there, proposed the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, during this time period. And it pretty much says that there should be no discrimination on the basis of sex. So it's really short, and it also says that the government is allowed to pass laws to help enforce that. That does not pass. We're going to try to pass that 3 times, once in the 20s, once in the 50s, and then once again in the 70s. So we're 0 for 3 on that. I don't think we'll try again because I think enough court cases have gone through to establish that the 14th Amendment also applies to women. And we've passed an Equal Pay Act. So as long as maybe those things are enforced, which they mostly are, I suppose, although you could argue that they're not. But anyway, so this proposed elimination of all discrimination based on sex doesn't pass. What you do get instead is flappers. And if you have English class on campus, I don't know that they care about this in your ACC English class, but there was always that English teacher that had the dress party, 1920s party when they read The Great Gatsby. So people dress like flappers, usually girls, but occasionally boys. I mean, whatever you want. Shorter dresses, short hair. I don't think girls cut their hair for that day, but bobbed haircuts. Girls would go out in public and drink and dance and smoke and maybe even talk about sex. They had movies where they talked about sex. And it made it seem like the era was really promiscuous. And there was probably a small group of people who were. The culture was more promiscuous. I think the average person probably wasn't. And the group of people who participated in this cultural stuff, you know that they're young people. So people who are, your age to mid-20s. So before you get married, settle down, have some kids, that kind of thing. And this was much more of an urban thing. And it tended to be more of a middle class or upper middle class thing. Poor people in the country didn't do this. Rich people in the country probably didn't do this either because they were in the country. Poor people in general don't participate in a lot of those fads because, they're busy working and they don't have extra money for this stuff. And it doesn't change the majority of people in the United States. However, it does change the culture of the United States, where music and movies become more attuned to flapper culture. So it's sort of like, my guess is you all listen to, well, I don't know that you all listen to certain types of music because now you can, you listen on your devices, so you don't listen to radio stations, but you can kind of pick and choose your own thing. But you all know certain musicians, like I was unaware of Cardi B until I think the last year I taught at your school, actually. And somebody persuaded me it would be good to watch a Cardi B video, which I think was a mistake. But I guess she has some song out that's kind of inappropriate because I see older people complaining about it on Facebook. And my guess is most of you are aware of this song, probably know some of the lyrics to the song, but probably most of you don't aspire to be the type of person who is mentioned in the song. So you're aware of the culture. It probably doesn't change how you live. It might change how you dress or what hairstyle you have, but it probably doesn't change your basic plan in life. So I think flapper culture is pretty similar. And we mentioned already the business of America is business. So no more interest in reform. Also, no more interest in electing Democrats. The 20s was definitely a Republican decade. So the Republicans get associated with the prosperity of the 20s, which also means when that prosperity ends, they also get blamed for how it ended. So we have only Republican presidents in the 20s. Start off with Harding. Harding has some little scandalous things that go on, Teapot Dome and Elk Hills, where the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, loans out federal land so some oil companies can harvest the oil. But instead of putting the money in the government treasury, he keeps the money for himself and shares it with a few other government officials who go to jail because that is illegal. It may have been more closely connected to Harding, but when they start to investigate that is when Harding dies, probably of a heart attack, possibly of a stroke, and there's even some suggestion that his wife might have poisoned him, although there's no good evidence of that. That's just sort of a fun conspiracy that people like to talk about a little bit. Mostly because apparently Harding's a very bad husband. I say this because apparently he liked to date, which is never a good plan once you're married. So Harding's out after a year or two. Coolidge takes over. Calvin Coolidge is really conservative and lives a very conservative sort of life, so we're not going to have to worry about him dating or, selling, loaning out government land. But he's the guy who says the business of America is business, and what's good for General Motors is good for America. He'll finish Harding's term and get one of his own. He continues laissez-faire economic policies. And you're probably thinking, of course he does. Wouldn't we all? So laissez-faire apparently just means leave it alone. So it's the idea that the government needs to stay out of regulating business, but the government goes way beyond that and really helps business. Foreign policy changes to where it's not focused at all on intervention or military stuff. We just want to trade with people. The only intervention we have is colonialism, and we're intervening to make sure we control the oil supply. So that kind of starts during this time period and continues for a long time period. Some people would argue even to this day. Also, we're concerned about communists and socialists and anarchists and anti-government people, and the Schenck case is a good example of that concern. Schenck is one of the IWW types who suggests to workers that they should not register for the draft. And he gets arrested for that suggestion and he gets deported. So before he gets deported, he appeals to the Supreme Court and says, hey, this seems like a violation of my First Amendment rights, mostly because it was. Only the Supreme Court said, hey, it is not, because not all speech is protected. Some speech that is not protected would be that type that presents a clear and present danger, and that some speech is like falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater. Have you ever heard either of those phrases before? That's where I need a spokesperson for the class. So your speech is not protected if it presents a clear and present danger, or if it's like falsely shouting fire in the crowded theater. Okay, you haven't heard those. Okay. All right, thank you, spokesperson.
No.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, excuse me, sorry. Well, if you hung out with Supreme Court lovers, you would have heard those. So I guess you guys are not, it's okay that you're not Supreme Court lovers. Although, certainly some interesting stuff going on related to the Supreme Court right now. The guy who wrote that ruling was Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's pretty famous in Supreme Court circles. And I don't know that our standard is quite the same now as it was back then. As a matter of fact, I know that it is not quite the same now, because do you get the impression that it's okay to say anti-government things in the modern era? Have you heard people say them and not go to jail? Like, do you ever watch the news and people say like,
Yes, I have.
You have. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate the spokesman here. Appreciate it. However, do you feel like the government does restrict your freedom of speech in some ways? Are you aware of any of those ways?
If it's like does something to harm other people or anything like that, they stop it.
Yeah, no, you still have that clear and present. Yeah, those standards still apply. I think they're just, more modern.
Yeah, like if you like threaten to hurt someone, you could
Yeah.
go away for that.
Yep, that's true. And there's different standards too, like if you threaten the president versus you threaten your history teacher, or you threaten your brother. So, of course, that could be dangerous when you threaten your brother because you got to answer to your parents. But I know one of the early years that I taught in Leander ISD, I had a student write in a paper. The paper was about foreign policy of Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams. I'm sure it was a very exciting paper. And President Clinton, that tells you how long ago that I started teaching. President Clinton was in town for a fundraiser. And one of my students wrote in their paper about Adams and Jefferson foreign policy, that it was high time that someone assassinate President Clinton. Well, since he was in town and he's the president, there are certain things as a high school teacher you have to report. So I reported that, and the Secret Service was there the next day. That was one of the most amazing things that I saw teaching in Leander ISD. I never thought I'd see the Secret Service. It's very exciting. And they did, have a chat with that young man. Very long chat with that young man. Also, the government now, they monitor some of your speech, your electronic speech, so they can listen. They record and listen into phone calls sometimes. They are able to monitor your texts, your emails, your messages, that sort of thing. So, with increased technology, also comes increased scrutiny. And that happened really as a result of 9/11. But yeah, anti-government speech, generally protected, but when it looks like it's threatening, it's not. And of course, because you've been in school for a while, there are certain places where your freedom of speech is limited. School, of course, is one of those, because I know students would say some things in class, and I would say, like, hey, at school we don't say the F word, and they would say, well, that's not fair, you're limiting my freedom of speech. And I would say, also my freedom of speech is limited at school because I also cannot say the F word to you, although I never would. But the principals get upset about that when the teachers swear at the kids. I don't know why. But certain situations, certain places, your freedoms can be limited. But in general, your freedom of speech, sort of open, sort of. And we'll change over time what we think is dangerous speech. So moderately interesting, perhaps. All right, do you guys have any questions? Is there anything you want to ask before we go on to religion and the KKK, which you wouldn't think are related? Probably aren't directly, but indirectly might be. Okay, somebody else is coming in. Let me see if they were here before. They were. All right, so religion is very trendy in the 20s. It's very common for most people to go to church a lot during that time period. I think pretty much it's expected that you go at least weekly. Fundamentalism is a growing part of the religious sector during that time period. Fundamentalism is the type of Christianity where you believe that the Bible is literally true. And there's different kind of ranges of fundamentalism where you think every word is literally true. There's the range where you think most of it's true, but some of it's symbolic. But this tends to be a little more of a Protestant thing than a Catholic thing. So Protestant Christianity is kind of growing during this time period, especially the We Love the Bible version of Protestant Christianity. And because of that, you start to see conflicts between church and maybe the schools in some way, because they've started to publish more of the theories of Charles Darwin. So it becomes a little more accepted to teach evolution at school. And in certain states, we'll say Tennessee in this instance, they pass a law that says that it is illegal for you to teach it's illegal for you to teach evolution in school. And the guy who passed it was a guy named butler. So it was called the Butler Law. And the intent of the law really was so that you would think that, uh-oh, I can hear you. We need to mute somebody, don't we?
You should focus on that.
So the Butler Law was supposed to show that this butler, who was a politician, was more religious than other politicians. And the goal wasn't necessarily to enforce this, but it was really just to make sure that people understood how spiritual that Butler was. So, and we've done stuff like that in Texas. Can you imagine that people would pass a law they didn't intend to really be enforced? I think one of those laws, let me see if I can pick the right person to mute. I think one of those laws that was like that was, you know how you guys, when you're in school, you say the pledge every day? Pledge to the US flag and the Texas flag, and then you have a minute of silence. I really think the person who passed that law was doing it for the same reason, just to make sure everybody understood he was very spiritual, more so than other people, was my impression when that was passed. Okay, so the ACLU thought that that law, the you can't teach evolution law, was unconstitutional. So they wanted to challenge it. So they needed to find someone who was willing to teach evolution. The guy they found was a guy named John Scopes. And John Scopes wasn't a biology teacher, really. He was a football coach who was subbing for a biology teacher who was out. Oh, somebody's raising their hand.
Hi. So I just have a quick question. I just got a thing about like wanting me to unmute. I was just wondering. I'm sorry. What was going on?
Oh, I
there?
don't know. I don't know.
Oh,
I think
okay.
I was trying to figure out, you can mute, unmute. I'm sorry. I was trying to figure
No, it's
out
fine.
whose phone conversation we were hearing. So I was scrolling through and I must have clicked on the wrong person. But I think I figured out whose it was. It wasn't you, so sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
All right. I'm still not good at Zoom. You would think after the last few months, I'd be better at it. Okay. So teaching evolution, John Scopes, football coach, subbing for biology teacher, and his college buddy, George, said, hey, John, will you teach evolution? And then we're going to get you arrested so we can challenge this law. And he goes like, yeah, whatever, that sounds interesting. So he did it. And they tried, he said, but my only thing is I don't know anything about evolution. So he just gave him the book Origin of the Species, and the guy read it to his class for 2 weeks. Wouldn't that be a fun science class? So after he reads it for 2 weeks, he gets arrested. But he has a hard time getting arrested because the ACLU wants him to be arrested. They report him to the school board and the county, and neither of them will arrest him. It's like, no, we have better things to do than arrest some guy because he talked about evolution in a science class. But they push it enough that he gets arrested, then he gets charged. So then the ACLU had told him that we'll provide a good defense for you. So they hire, actually he does it for free, a guy named Clarence Darrow to defend him. Clarence Darrow is the best defense attorney in the country during that time period. And I always try to think, who do we have that compares to that in the modern era? And I don't know that we do. But usually when I would ask students, they'd say, well, I don't know, some TV lawyer or something. When I first started teaching, maybe Johnny Cochran was the guy, or the Kardashian fellow was a very fine lawyer as well. Maybe it's Amy Coney Barrett. I don't know, but she's not a defense attorney, of course. But this guy was just a masterful attorney. So then the county says, well, we have to get a really good attorney as well. So they hire William Jennings Bryan. Well, he does it for free because he wants to make a statement about the importance of the Bible in American culture, which he does. These guys are friends. because they traveled in similar circles for a long time and knew each other. But they don't treat each other, brilliantly well during the trial. The trial's sort of a big show trial. There's a little carnival atmosphere around it. They put a big sign on the courthouse that says, "Read your Bible every day." Clarence Darrow gets to cross-examine William Jennings Bryan as an expert on the Bible, but it's really seen as a chance for people to argue the values of science versus religion. So when the trial is over, Scopes is convicted because he did teach evolution. This was the outcome that they wanted because you can't appeal the decision if you win. And they said they would not pay the fine. He was assessed a $100 fine, and that they would argue it all the way to the Supreme Court. They would appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court, which they didn't get to do because it got overturned at the next level. So it was overturned because the judge gave the fine instead of the jury. A fairly famous reporter, a guy named H.L. Mencken, said that this trial showed the death of fundamentalism, which was certainly not true. But it was an interesting argument between the people who thought that it was time to be more focused on science and the people who thought that that focus on science would take away from a focus on religion. So it's an important cultural moment. They reenact this trial every year. If you ever want to go to Tennessee and see it, it's in June. I have not gone. I'm kind of a history nerd, but I haven't gone to this. It's in Dayton, Tennessee. So it's supposed to be kind of a good opportunity to watch people debate, to have a principled intellectual argument. So there's also a movie about it. It's called Inherit the Wind, which I have seen the movie. It's really a good movie. It's just completely inaccurate, as most movies about historical things are, but very entertaining and well done. It's old though. I don't know if you guys would like it. Pretty old. All right. This is called, did I even tell you what this was called? The Scopes Monkey Trial. Oh my goodness. I talked about it all that time and didn't tell you it was called Scopes Monkey Trial. Scopes because of John Scopes, and monkey because evolution. We didn't descend from monkeys. That was one of the things that you heard people say in this trial setting. But not either of the lawyers. Neither of the lawyers talked like that really. Another guy who was prominent during this time period was a guy named Billy Sunday, which is a great name for a preacher. He was an evangelist, so kind of a traveling preacher. And he had been a pretty famous baseball player before he was a preacher. So he was trendy and more of an urban evangelist kind of guy. We don't so much have those guys anymore. If we have anybody like that, would have been Billy Graham, but he's no longer with us. And his son is probably a little like that. But it's hard to compare these guys to modern preachers because churches in the United States now tend to be either like really big or really small. And the really big ones, sometimes, like if you see them on TV, you think, well, that guy really just wants money. Nobody really thought that about these traveling preachers in this era. So later on. All right. Butler Law, we just talked about that. All right. So we'll finish our class today by talking about the KKK. Ooh. So the KKK has a resurgence in the 20s. You see them really popular after the Civil War, and then really popular in the 20s when we're very anti-immigrant, and then you see them in the 50s and 60s when we're having a civil rights movement. The KKK kind of rebrands themselves during this time period as the protectors of Americanism. So their push is that people should assimilate. And they also were supposed to be in favor of prohibition. And they opposed communism and really just anything that didn't seem American, which apparently is Jewish people, Catholic people, immigrants from countries we don't like, feminists, immorality in general, that sort of thing. They'll have a march on Washington that about 50,000 people participate in. They will have a candidate for president. Can't remember if it's 20, I think it's the 24 election. It was a guy named David Stevenson. And there's books written about him as well. He's a weirdly interesting fellow. But he says that he's the candidate of Americanism, that he's pro-family, pro-women, pro-prohibition, that sort of thing. What they eventually find out about him is that he was an alcoholic who will eventually get convicted of raping and murdering a elementary school teacher who was like a super wholesome Sunday school teaching kind of chick. So that, oddly enough, by the end of the decade, helps to ruin the reputation of the KKK, and they're seen as just a bunch of dishonest rogue type people during that era, or after that era. So in the 20s, there's certain places that honestly you probably wouldn't be elected or get certain jobs with the city or county unless you were in the KKK. By the end of the decade, nationally, the KKK is going to lose prestige. Regionally, Midwest, South especially, those two regions, KKK is going to remain fairly strong influence, which is weird to think about, perhaps. All right. So I think I'm unmuting the person that I think was having the phone conversation. All right, or it could have been an in-person conversation. Who knows? All right, so next time we'll start at that same point where we start to talk about the NAACP and the Harlem Renaissance, but we'll also talk more specifically about the weekly question. So before we go, let me go ahead and stop the recording.